The idea of spiritual covering or church covering is not biblical, and in the wrong hands, it's a tool that can be used by leadership to expand their authority and manipulate congregations. Wow, when I say it like that, it seems like I'm coming in hot. Let's start this way instead. Dear Christian, if you're part of a church organization and a pastor ever preaches a sermon where something is said like, when you're a part of this church, you're covered in prayer. When you're a part of this church, you're blessed because this church is blessed and that blessing overflows to you. In this church, we're a family and you're covered under our guidance, family prayers, and blessing. In this church, we have a special mandate from God. So when you're a part of this church, this mandate flows over to you and stuff like that. And to support this idea, the leader uses the idea that the disciples were covered when they were being sent out by Jesus and the promise of household salvation in Acts 16 and 1 Corinthians 7, saying the church family is the pastor's house. So as long as you are part of this church, ipso facto, you're part of the leadership's family and thus saved. So if you're around this, tread lightly, because you may be in process of being manipulated. Now, this is not a blanket statement for all churches. I know many good churches and church leaders who don't pull this stuff, but ones that do, be wary, because the power is in what is not being said. And that's what's dangerous about sermons that use elements like that, because it's to be inferred that when you aren't part of this church, then you aren't being prayed for. That when you're not part of this church, you're not under the church's protective covering and thus in some kind of danger. That when you aren't in this church and operating as the family sees fit, you're going to be left all on your own. And if the pastor is the one that holds the power as the head of that family, you probably want to stay on their good side and listen to everything they have to say, right? If used by an unscrupulous leader, this idea of church covering can be leveraged in order to increase or maintain attendance and tithe, implying that if you are part of the church, then you will receive certain things unavailable to people outside of the church. And boys and girls, there's no real precedence for this power play in the Bible. And one of the ways this power is demonstrated is when leadership controls access to who you can and cannot be around. For instance, someone who leaves the church. If someone leaves your church and your church leadership implies that you shouldn't be friends with that person or the family since they've stepped out of the church's covering, that it's implied if you do so, you'll face repercussions, run. Do not walk away. This is a manipulative, territorial spirit at work and has nothing to do with the Spirit of Christ. You can be friends with people who leave your church on good terms, bad terms, or no terms. Your pastor doesn't get to tell you who your friends are or judge you or punish you because of them. That's not the loving, giving, gracious Spirit of Jesus. And if someone is out of the spiritual covering of the church, it's okay. A person's relationship and standing with God has nothing to do with the church you go to. According to Romans 3:29 and Matthew 12:36, each person is ultimately accountable only to God, not to any other person or organization. And that includes churches. Sure, it's smart to consult with others for guidance. Proverbs 11:14 and Proverbs 5:11 through 14 states it's good to be humble and learn from the wisdom of others. And yes, leaders are charged with responsibility for those within their guidance. But that doesn't mean that authority ends with your pastor or leadership, because you know what? There's stuff they don't know nor have experience in. Many pastors have no real training concerning mental health or medical interventions or counseling abuse. There's often very little licensure there. They can speak from their experience or what they've gleaned from the Bible, or most likely what the pastor has been taught from their pastor. But in seminary, there's very little actual training there other than an elective or two. Yet we still have people in the church system being shamed for needing outside help in these departments, or being met with disapproval when they seek guidance outside of the church structure. But guess what? Our approval as believers comes from God, not mankind, and that's 2 Timothy 2:15. No one person or group has the absolute right to declare any portion of your or anyone else's love and service to God valid or invalid, according to Romans 14:4. When someone leaves a church congregation, or guess what? If you leave the church congregation you're a part of, Jesus loves them and you just as much as he did before they left that particular matrix. Jesus, in fact, speaks against excessive earthly authority in Matthew 20:25 through 28. It doesn't mean leaders don't have authority. They do, as long as it's as a true servant of a loving and forgiving God. But all too often, the idea of a church's spiritual covering, which is a fairly recent thing, by the way, that only became popular during the shepherding movement of the 1970s and 80s, and has bled over to many other church systems since then, is actually used for authoritarian structures, the cover-up of abuse, and let's be honest, cult-like intimidation. Like when a leader says you can't hang out with this person or participate in this event because they aren't part of the church's covering. That's control. And well, I'm just going to call it what it is. It's spiritual abuse. It's manipulation. That is not Jesus, and you don't have to take it. You are allowed to think differently, vote differently, live differently, sing differently, worship differently. Your church leadership says you have to. They don't get to make your choices for you and imply excommunication from the congregation or faith if you don't choose to believe as they do. And shocker, you can be friends with people who leave your church. And double shocker, you can be friends with people who leave the faith. Trust me, they may need you now more than ever. A beautiful church is a community. It is a gathering. We gather to learn from one another, to share with one another, to be with one another. And there are amazing churches out there and incredible pastors who literally work 60, 70, 80, 90 hours a week tirelessly, serving their communities under their guidance. Their guidance, not control. And don't ever let leadership tell you who you can and can't be friends with or exert that much control over your life. It's a church, not a gang. And the only one who actually rules and reigns says you have direct access to him. This access is not granted by the church you go to. Your church leadership are not the gatekeepers to this blessing of union with your Creator. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, which includes freedom from abusive structures that try to insert themselves into places in your life that they have no business accessing. Spiritual or church covering, it's not biblical. It's a tool of manipulation. God bless. See you soon.